Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a genuinely fascinating, centuries-old theological debate. We're taking a completely objective look at the source material surrounding the nature of Jesus. Is he God incarnate, or is he a uniquely empowered human agent? We're going to explore exactly how biblical Unitarians critique the traditional arguments for the deity of Christ, and we'll do it all by looking straight at the textual evidence and the arguments laid out in our sources.
Okay, let's dive into this. For centuries, theologians have practically argued in circles over the fundamental identity of Christ. And the core question we're tackling today through our sources is this: did Jesus really do what only God can do? Now, traditional Trinitarians generally say absolutely yes, pointing to specific actions, miracles, and titles. But Unitarians, well, they look at those exact same biblical texts and draw a wildly different conclusion. So let's look at exactly how this debate is structured.
Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We're going to methodically break this down into 5 key areas. First, the H.A.N.D.S acronym debate. Second, names, focusing on statistics and titles. Third, attributes, looking at limitations and contingency. Fourth, honors, comparing agency versus essence. And finally, number 5, the gospel alternative.
All right, starting off with Section 1, the H.A.N.D.S acronym debate. Let's set the stage here.
So, to really grasp the Unitarian pushback, we first have to understand what exactly they're pushing back against. The source material references a very popular apologetic acronym used to argue for the deity of Christ. It's called H.A.N.D.S. That stands for honors, attributes, names, deeds, and seat. Traditional apologetics, like the book The Incarnate Christ and His Critics that our sources reference, uses these 5 categories to argue that Jesus shares the divine essence. Today, we're going to see exactly how the Unitarian perspective deconstructs 3 of these specific categories.
Moving right along to Section 2, names, statistics, and titles. And honestly, prepare yourself for a truly fascinating statistical breakdown of the text.
Let's kick this off with a pretty massive number found in the text: 1,291. According to the source analysis, this is the exact number of times the New Testament refers to the Father as God. Think about that for a second. In the historical and cultural context of the first century, when a writer said God, they were overwhelmingly, almost exclusively referring to the Father. The source material notes that traditional scholars absolutely acknowledge this massive count. It sets a really strong baseline for how the word God was understood by the original audience.
Now, I want you to contrast that massive number with this one, just 10. The sources note that traditional apologists claim there are perhaps 10 times the text potentially refers to Jesus as God, in verses like John 1:1 or John 20:28. But here's the catch. Unitarians argue that even these few sporadic instances are highly debated translations or just contextual misunderstandings. For example, they point out that earlier manuscripts have variations, or that the context implies the word God is being used in a representational sense. So Unitarians use this massive statistical disparity, 1,291 compared to a heavily debated 10, to challenge the traditional view. They argue, if the authors intended to present Jesus as equally God, the text wouldn't overwhelmingly reserve the title exclusively for the Father.
And this brings us to specific verses Unitarians use to build their case, like John 17:3. In this passage, Jesus is actually praying to the Father, and he says, "This is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Unitarians point out something huge here. Jesus explicitly distinguishes himself from the Father, who he literally identifies as the only true God. They argue that if Jesus is intentionally excluding himself from being the only true God, well, that creates a pretty massive logical hurdle for traditional theology.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the distinction between 2 very specific, often confused phrases. We constantly hear Jesus called the Son of God. But Unitarians emphasize that in its ancient Jewish context, Son of God was actually a messianic, Davidic title for a human king. It's much like how the ancient kings of Israel were called God's sons. It wasn't some ontological claim to a pre-existent divine nature. In fact, our sources highlight a really surprising point. The phrase God the Son, which directly implies a second divine person in a trinity, never actually appears anywhere in the biblical text, not once.
Let's shift gears to Section 3, attributes, limitations, and contingency. We're going to examine the arguments surrounding his actual limitations.
So, traditional theology assigns these grand divine qualities to Jesus, but Unitarians present some really strong counterarguments that highlight his genuine human limitations. Just look at this comparison. For omniscience, Unitarians point out that Jesus had real, genuine limitations. I mean, he explicitly stated he didn't know the day or hour of his return. Only the Father knew that. For immortality, they note his genuine mortality. He actually died on the cross, which by definition an immortal God simply cannot do. And for omnipotence, they point out that Jesus required rest. He slept, and he was empowered by God rather than acting from his own inherent unlimited power.
Now, to explain how Jesus could be God but still experience these very human limitations, traditional apologists use a concept called partitive exegesis. Basically, this means separating Jesus' human and divine natures. They might say something like, well, he didn't know the hour in his human nature, but he definitely knew it in his divine nature. Our Unitarian sources neutrally point out that this creates a pretty severe paradox. They argue it almost implies a level of deception. Think about it. If you're asked a question and your divine nature knows the answer, but you say, I don't know because your human nature doesn't, that's kind of deceptive to your audience. Unitarians argue it's just much simpler to take Jesus at face value. He simply didn't know because he was genuinely a limited human agent.
All right, moving into section 4, honors, agency versus essence. We're going to look at a really vital difference here. And this brilliantly illustrates the point. The distinction between two specific Greek words is incredibly revealing. In ancient Greek, there are two distinct words that often just get translated into English as worship, blurring the lines entirely. First, we have proskuneo. This essentially means bowing in honor or deep respect to a human king or a superior. Second, there's latrio. Now this is divine, sacred worship reserved absolutely and solely for God. Unitarians highlight that yes, Jesus receives proskuneo, which is entirely appropriate for God's exalted royal agent. But according to the sources, the New Testament never records Jesus receiving latrio. That specific, highly sacred worship meant for God alone, that remains exclusively with the Father.
This brings us right to an absolutely crucial Unitarian concept, agency versus essence. Agency is all about acting on behalf of another authority rather than acting from your own inherent, independent essence. Unitarians argue that the miracles Jesus performed, calming the storm, healing the sick, and even the authority he possessed to forgive sins, are all the result of him acting as God's fully empowered human representative. I mean, he explicitly stated he could do nothing on his own. He is the agent functioning in a role designated entirely by the ultimate source, God the Father.
Let's wrap things up with Section 5, the Gospel Alternative. Let's look at this alternative framework.
So, to directly counter that traditional H.A.N.D.S acronym we talked about earlier, the Unitarian sources propose the Gospel acronym. Let's break this down point by point. G is for given life by his Father. This means his existence is contingent, not self-existent. O stands for offered his life for us, meaning he is genuinely mortal and capable of dying. S is for subordinate to God. He's not co-equal. The Father is his ultimate superior. P is for peccable, meaning he was entirely capable of being tempted, yet he managed to remain completely sinless through obedience. E means empowered by God's Spirit to perform miracles, rather than pulling from some intrinsic divine power. And finally, L is for limited in knowledge, exactly like we saw with him not knowing the day or the hour. This whole framework serves as a direct, textually based counterargument to the Trinitarian view.
So the crucial point is this. The Unitarian thesis presented in our source material defines the genuine Jesus not as God the Son, but as an exalted human agent who was chosen, uniquely empowered, and ultimately elevated by God to be the Messiah. They argue that this specific view is deeply, deeply rooted in the historical and textual context of the early church, and that it's completely separate from all the later theological traditions and church councils that followed.
And all of this leaves us with a truly fascinating reflection. When we look at these linguistic nuances, those massive statistical disparities we talked about, and the ancient concepts of royal agency, you gotta ask yourself, how much do our modern theological lenses alter the way we read ancient texts? When we strip away centuries of tradition, what is the text actually trying to tell us? It's a deep, complex web of biblical translation and historical tradition that absolutely invites further study. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and as always, keep questioning.